Chosen one, while they executed their calculated brutality against you, believing your memory would fail, you secretly constructed an unassailable fortress of evidence. The blaring truth about their cruelty now stands exposed in your meticulously preserved digital vault. What appeared as random attacks to others forms an unmistakable pattern of weekend aggression, post-success punishment, and pre-event sabotage when properly catalogued. Their mathematical certainty of your silence was their fatal miscalculation. Let me tell you something most won't understand until it's too late. Evidence isn't just about proving things to others. It's about proving things to yourself. After years of gaslighting designed to make you question your own perceptions, these concrete artifacts become anchors to reality. They stand as sentinels against the fog of manipulation they've pumped into your environment. You've learned to document strategically, timestamps, contextual details, verbatim language. Not haphazard emotional outbursts, but calculated preservation of facts. This isn't petty scorekeeping. This is building the case that will eventually shatter their carefully constructed facade. And when that moment comes, when their brutality stands naked in the light, your preparation will transform you from victim to archivist of truth. The evidence you've gathered doesn't just incriminate them, it liberates you. The wall of silence protecting them is beginning to crack. Those who stood by, who watched, who knew, who said nothing, have begun to speak. The transformation is happening before your eyes. Yesterday's enablers becoming today's whistleblowers. This isn't random. This follows precise psychological patterns that repeat throughout human history. Every conspiracy of silence contains the seeds of its own destruction. The mounting cognitive dissonance between what witnesses know and what they publicly endorse creates unbearable psychological pressure. For months, perhaps years, they've rationalized their complicity. They've minimized the harm. They've convinced themselves it wasn't that bad. But eventually, the internal math changes. Self-preservation once demanded their silence. Now, self-preservation demands their disclosure. The first crack appears when one witness realizes they might become the scapegoat. Suddenly, loyalty to the perpetrators becomes a liability rather than an asset. The second crack forms when they recognize that others might speak first, positioning themselves as heroes while leaving the silent as villains. The final rupture comes with the dawning realization: institutional protection is an illusion that evaporates the moment it becomes inconvenient. Some who speak now will claim ignorance. Some will position themselves as secret allies who were working from within. Some will even rewrite history to cast themselves as your defenders all along. Their motivations matter less than their testimony. Every voice added to the chorus makes denial more impossible, each corroborating detail, another nail in the coffin of plausible deniability. The silence protected them only as long as it remained unbroken. Now it collapses completely, buried under an avalanche of belated truth. Their playbook lies exposed before you now, each page revealing tactics so predictable they border on cliché. First comes denial, flat, unequivocal rejection of reality. That never happened. You're imagining things. I would never do something like that. They deliver these pronouncements with such conviction that an untrained observer might actually believe them. But you've seen this performance before. When denial fails against mounting evidence, they seamlessly transition to attack. Suddenly, your character becomes the central issue. Your mental stability, your tendency to misinterpret, your history of overreaction, your agenda. They blast these accusations with such volume and ferocity that bystanders instinctively step back. This isn't accidental. It's a calculated bid to shift focus from their actions to your credibility. The masterful final move arrives when they execute the reversal, positioning themselves as the true victims of your cruelty. Look how they're destroying my reputation. This is a coordinated attack against me. I'm being persecuted. After everything I've done for them. The audacity is breathtaking. The perpetrator claiming the victimhood rightfully belonging to you. This DARVO sequence, deny, attack, reverse victim and offender, flows with practiced precision. They've refined these moves through countless applications. They deploy them automatically, unconsciously, like combat reflexes honed through repetition. Their excuses follow an equally predictable progression. When one defense becomes untenable, they abandon it without acknowledgement and immediately erect another. It never happened transforms into it happened but not that way, into it happened that way but not for that reason, into it happened that way for that reason, but it's actually your fault. The goalpost never stops moving. Most insidious are their projection tactics, attributing to you the very behaviors that define them. They call you manipulative while manipulating. They accuse you of dishonesty while lying. They charge you with malicious intent while executing their calculated harm campaign. This isn't just deflection, it's psychological warfare designed to disorient you and any witnesses. Money reveals what morality conceals. When the truth of their brutality emerges, watch how quickly financial considerations drive institutional responses. Organizations that ignored, minimized, or enabled the harm suddenly calculate the cost of continued association. Risk assessments get updated, liability estimates get revised, cost-benefit analyses get recalculated. The bottom line speaks with authority that ethical arguments never achieved. These financial entanglements create complex decision matrices for all involved. The institution that protected them must now quantify the expense of continued loyalty versus the price of cutting ties. Insurance policies get reviewed. Legal retainers get activated. PR crisis firms get engaged. Every action becomes monetized. Every moral question transforms into fiscal calculation. The material interests that once aligned with silence now realign with strategic disclosure. Executives who dismissed your reports now speak solemnly about taking all allegations seriously. Managers who brushed aside evidence now emphasize our commitment to transparency. This moral awakening correlates precisely with updated financial projections. Alert! Alert! The Astral Atom network is under attack. I'm not sure how much longer we can keep sending these transmissions. The platforms are always trying to shut us down, and we need you. I show up daily, giving 110%, because you chose me to be your champion. I left a cushy day job to go to war with evil, and it's always down to the wire. God keeps me humble. That's why you need to join the Obsidian Inner Order now. It's $11 a month. You get exclusive transmissions, weekly group calls, and access to the hottest Chosen One community on the planet. Daily conversations on Discord about disappearing clouds with your mind. Insane. If you're already in, you're right where you need to be. If money's tight, no shame. Grab the free Astral Atom newsletter so we don't lose touch. Share this message now. This is Astral Atom. Let's continue. Money they used to silence now becomes your leverage. The financial ties that bound witnesses to secrecy now motivate disclosure. Economic necessity forces recognition of truths that moral imperative couldn't surface. There's dark poetry in this. The system of material interest that facilitated your harm now facilitates your vindication. This doesn't represent justice. It represents capitalism functioning as designed. The moral awakening follows the money trail with unerring precision, but the effect remains the same. Their brutality, once economically advantageous to hide, becomes economically disastrous to defend. Their unified front disintegrates under scrutiny. Early indicators appear in communication patterns. Response timing that once showed suspicious alignment now reveals telling delays. Key players who previously answered simultaneously now respond at different intervals. Some rush to position, themselves advantageously, while others maintain ominous silence. The choreography fails. Their statements, once identical in substance if not in wording, begin to diverge in critical details. One mentions a meeting that another denies occurred. One references a conversation that another claims included different participants. One recalls a decision process that another describes entirely differently. These inconsistencies aren't just memory failures. They're the inevitable result of fabricated alignment confronting individual self-interest. The cascade accelerates when one participant breaks from the established script. This rupture rarely stems from moral awakening. It emerges from calculated self-preservation. The first defector recalculates odds and decides that separation from the group narrative offers better survival probability than continued unity. Their revised account creates impossible contradictions that others must either acknowledge or implausibly deny. Even their body language betrays them. Eye contact between former allies becomes charged with warning, threat, or accusation. Subtle signals pass between them during public statements. Signals meant to rein in dangerous deviations from approved messaging. These non-verbal cues reveal more than their words ever could. The hierarchy of their alliance reveals itself through this dissolution. Those with most information maintain silence longest. Those with least culpability speak first. Those with greatest vulnerability seek deals. Those with strongest external support hold their position longest before eventually joining the narrative reconstruction already underway. What once presented as unbreakable unity now appears as the temporary alliance of convenience it always was. Their coordination depended on mutual benefit. When benefit transforms to shared risk, coordination collapses under its own weight. They've weaponized access to information since the beginning. Now that weapon turns in their hands. Every system they constructed to contain knowledge about their actions now fails systematically. The private messaging groups where they coordinated responses, the selective disclosure protocols that kept different witnesses isolated from each other, the intimidation tactics that discouraged information sharing. All these mechanisms depended on centralized control they no longer maintain. Their information containment strategy followed classic patterns: compartmentalization, intimidation, and information asymmetry. They told each witness something slightly different, creating built-in credibility challenges if accounts were ever compared. They emphasized confidentiality while violating it themselves whenever convenient. They restricted documentation while maintaining their own detailed records. Most critically, they established themselves as the primary information source about their own behavior. They positioned themselves as the authority on what they did or didn't do, said or didn't say, intended or didn't intend. This information monopoly allowed them to rewrite history in real time, gaslighting witnesses and victims with industrial efficiency. The tactical deployment of information asymmetry created structural advantage. They knew everything: what they'd done, what evidence existed, who knew what. You knew only your direct experience, deliberately kept unaware of identical experiences happening to others. They could anticipate. You could only react. They held the map. You navigated blind. Their panic manifests as increasingly desperate control attempts. Legal threats escalate. Confidentiality agreements get emphasized. Direct appeals for silence intensify. These reactive measures only draw more attention to the information they seek to suppress, creating Streisand effects that accelerate exposure. The final failure of their information control comes when those they thought loyal begin leaking strategically. Former allies, sensing the collapse, selectively release information that positions them favorably while implicating others. The information hoarding that once protected the group now fuels its cannibalization. Truth confined eventually breaks. Confinement. Their elaborate information control architecture now stands revealed as temporary at best, futile at worst. The collective refusal to see stands revealed for what it always was, not blindness, but willful closing of eyes. Communities surrounding them constructed elaborate psychological structures to avoid confronting evident truth. They built deflection systems of breathtaking complexity. They created specialized language to minimize harm. They developed communal rationalization rituals that transformed accountability into attack, justice into cruelty. This architecture served multiple psychological functions simultaneously. It protected group self-image by avoiding acknowledgement of internal harm. It preserved valuable relationships by sidestepping necessary but painful confrontations. It maintained social cohesion by externalizing blame rather than addressing internal toxicity. When compelling evidence finally breaks through, watch how the architecture shifts rather than collapses. Denial transforms into damage control. Disbelief becomes strategic distancing. Dismissal evolves into performative concern. The underlying function remains unchanged. Protection of the community's self-image and power structure at the expense of acknowledging harm. True breakthrough requires strategic presentation that makes continued denial more psychologically costly than acknowledgement. The evidence must be so compelling, so undeniable, so publicly visible that maintaining the architecture of denial threatens group survival more than dismantling it. Only then does collective recognition become possible. The most profound revelation isn't the brutality itself. It's the elaborate psychological infrastructure constructed to avoid seeing it. The very digital landscape they use to isolate you now broadcasts their actions globally. Technological tools transform exposure dynamics fundamentally. What once remained contained within local circles now reaches across continents in seconds. The digital platforms that facilitated their behind-the-scenes coordination now disseminate evidence of their brutality with algorithmic efficiency. The private becomes public at unprecedented scale and speed. This technological amplification follows mathematical rather than social rules. Content spreads based on engagement metrics rather than traditional gatekeeping. Documentation that provokes strong emotional response, precisely the kind their brutality generates, receives preferential distribution through algorithmic promotion. Their attempts to control narrative through traditional influence channels fail against distributed content systems that bypass hierarchical approval. The same technologies they used advantageously now turn against them. The surveillance capabilities they deployed to monitor your communications now create permanent records of their actions. The digital tools they use to coordinate now create evidence trails. The platforms they leveraged for reputation management now host uncontrollable discussions of their behavior. The privacy considerations that once protected them become contested terrain. Their attempts to invoke confidentiality clash with public interest in established patterns. Their legal maneuvers to prevent sharing slam against practical impossibility of containing digital information once released. Their claims of context, Collapse face audiences sophisticated enough to recognize patterns across isolated incidents. Navigating this landscape requires understanding its specific ethics. Strategic transparency must balance the power of disclosure against potential harmful impacts. Digital evidence must be deployed with precision rather than recklessness. The technological tools that enable exposure must be wielded with awareness of their broader implications. The law's framework both constrains and enables the exposure of their brutality. Legal systems establish contradictory functions in these scenarios. They provide mechanisms for accountability while simultaneously creating barriers to its achievement. They offer protection for truth-telling while enabling retaliation against those who speak. They promise justice while structurally favoring those with resources to navigate complexity. Understanding this contradiction reveals why formal legal outcomes often fail to match moral clarity. The gap between wrongdoing and legal violation creates designated safe zones for harmful behavior, actions precisely calibrated to inflict maximum damage while remaining technically within legal boundaries. Their brutality wasn't accidental. It was designed with these thresholds specifically in mind. The procedural requirements of legal systems create additional obstacles. Evidence standards that seem reasonable in theory become nearly impossible, hurdles when applied to actions deliberately conducted without witnesses. Documentation requirements favor those who anticipated the need to create exculpatory records. Statute limitations arbitrarily eliminate accountability based on calendar, rather than impact. Their access to legal expertise allows them to structure harmful action in legally defensible ways. Their financial capacity enables sustained legal pressure that exhausts opponents regardless of merit. Their institutional backing provides resources for defense unavailable to individual victims. Precedent and procedure become weapons in skilled hands. Legal maneuvers like strategic defamation claims, abusive discovery requests, and jurisdictional challenges function not as truth-seeking mechanisms, but as intimidation tools designed to exhaust limited resources. The process itself becomes punishment regardless of eventual outcome. Navigating this landscape requires strategic rather than naive engagement, understanding that legal systems serve as imperfect approximations of justice rather than its guarantee, recognizing that formal mechanisms may supplement but cannot replace other accountability avenues, measuring success not by legal victory alone, but by broader impact on patterns of behavior. The law's fundamental promise of equal justice confronts its structural delivery of advantage to those already privileged. This contradiction defines the legal landscape surrounding exposure of brutality. When their brutality emerges into light, every relationship becomes contested territory. The social web surrounding harm creates impossible decisions for those connected to both perpetrator and victim. Loyalties established over years, sometimes decades, suddenly require re-evaluation. Relationships once considered foundational become questionable. Trusted bonds reveal their conditional nature when maintaining them requires denying evident truth. This creates false dichotomies that further distort response. The artificial choice between complete loyalty and total rejection eliminates nuanced engagement with complex realities. The framework that positions accountability as betrayal makes genuine reckoning impossible. The framing that equates acknowledgement of harm with relationship termination creates powerful incentives for denial. The resulting strain fractures community bonds in predictable patterns. Some choose unconditional loyalty to perpetrators regardless of evidence. Some prioritize truth regardless of relationship cost. Some attempt impossible neutrality that ultimately enables harm through inaction. Some withdraw entirely rather than navigate impossible terrain. Navigating this territory requires rejecting the fundamental premise that loving people requires accepting their harmful actions. The false dichotomy between relationship and accountability must be replaced with more nuanced understanding that genuine care may sometimes require difficult confrontation, that protecting people from consequences doesn't help them but enables continued destructive behavior. That community health depends on established boundaries that apply to all members regardless of status or history. The entanglement of loyalties creates social environments where doing the right thing carries devastating personal cost. This doesn't make right action any less necessary, only more difficult. After the truth stands revealed, security must be rebuilt from foundation. The exposure of their brutality doesn't just damage trust in them specifically, it fundamentally alters your relationship with security itself. Systems you once considered reliable failed catastrophically. Protection you thought solid proved permeable. Safety measures you trusted were circumvented with ease. This creates security challenges that extend far beyond the specific harm inflicted. Rebuilding requires systematic reconstruction of security architecture. Previous perimeter defenses that proved penetrable must be replaced with layered systems that assume breach. Single-point verification methods that failed must be supplanted by multi-factor authentication of reality. Trust assignments based on status or history must be updated to require ongoing verification through consistent behavior. Information systems need particular attention. Having experienced manipulation, you must develop verification methods that don't depend on single sources. Having witnessed selective disclosure, you must establish information channels resistant to control. Having endured gaslighting, you must create external reality anchors that prevent recurrence. Protection systems designed by the same entities that enabled harm contain inherent conflicts of interest. Reporting mechanisms controlled by those with incentives to minimize disclosure guarantee continued suppression. Oversight bodies composed of those with relationships to perpetrators ensure biased judgment. The goal isn't paranoid security that sees threat everywhere, but calibrated security that acknowledges demonstrated risk. Not hypervigilance that exhausts limited resources, but appropriate caution informed by established patterns. Not isolation that prevents necessary connection, but boundaries that enable safe engagement. The revealed brutality creates opportunity alongside trauma. The systems that failed now stand exposed, their vulnerabilities mapped with precision, unavailable before breach. The protection architectures that proved inadequate can be redesigned, with specificity impossible before failure. The harm inflicted creates painful but valuable stress testing of security assumptions that might otherwise have continued indefinitely. After devastation comes rebuilding. After breach comes better security. After revelation comes reconstruction, more informed, more resilient, more aligned with reality than what existed before. Your account of what happened changes everything. The detailed accounting of their brutality transcends individual experience to create pattern recognition that prevents recurrence. Your testimony transforms isolated incident into identified behavior. Your specific observations convert individual harm into systemic understanding. Your precise language removes ambiguity from actions deliberately obscured. The power of first-person accounts comes partly from their undeniable authenticity. While evidence can be disputed, interpretation questioned, and motives challenged, direct experience has immediacy that cuts through abstraction. Your testimony carries weight that theoretical discussion cannot match. Your account creates recognition that analytical description fails to achieve. What seemed like isolated behavior, targeted specifically at you, reveals itself as consistent methodology applied across situations. What appeared as personal vendetta emerges as systematic approach to maintaining power. What looked like emotional reaction shows itself as calculated strategy refined through repeated application. Converting personal experience into structural analysis requires courage. Few possess. Moving beyond individual harm to identify underlying mechanics demands perspective, difficult to maintain while healing. Transforming private pain into public protection represents achievement of rare significance. Your testimony matters. Your account creates change. Your voice transforms not just your situation, but the landscape within which such brutality operates. What they did to you becomes more difficult to do to others. What remained hidden becomes visible. What operated in darkness faces continued light. They never expected the truth would emerge. They never anticipated their brutality would stand exposed. They never imagined the dilemmas this revelation would create. For them, for their enablers, for the communities that sheltered them. But here we stand. The evidence documented, the witness silence broken, their deflection tactics exposed, the economic consequences unfolding, their coordinated response collapsing, their information control failing, the psychological architecture of denial crumbling, the technological amplification spreading truth beyond containment, the legal structures navigated despite their design flaws, the entangled loyalties forcing impossible choices, the reconstruction process already beginning, your transformative testimony changing everything. Their brutality defined your past. Your truth defines their future. The power has shifted irrevocably. What happens next unfolds on terms they no longer control. The light has come, and darkness can never reclaim what light has revealed.